from the wild quests of the banking and trading floors. This ex-banker has turned his attention to the wild quests of witnessing the most precious animals on the planet. Today's show is fascinating. Hello, Daz. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Well, thank you. And I am thrilled to be interviewing you. And I always have this moment where I'm preparing for conversations with people, and then I come across someone like yourself with a body of work that has twisted and turned. And I want to ask you a question, because something I noticed in the books that you've written, your journalism, you seem to be very passionate, regardless of the subject, with intended or unintended consequences and the justice that surrounds both those things. Am I even close to that being a thread in your work over the years, or?
I think the best way to describe the thread, if there is one, is I was told very early in my life by somebody who was very kind to me, actually. And he said to me, you have to know everything about something and something about everything. So I'm pretty much interested in everything. And what I've observed over my working life, and that includes my interests as well, is there are patterns to things. And I once wrote an essay for an American collection called Parallelism. And I said, what people do is look at one discipline. There are parallels across different disciplines. And you gain a heck of a lot if you actually understand what's happening in all these disciplines and you see the cross connections. And I like the fact that you mentioned consequences, because there's a very funny story around the last book I did on, I suppose, money. It's called A Banquet of Consequences. And that was based around a very famous quote by Robert Louis Stevenson. Whether it's true or not, everybody argues whether he ever said it or not, is that sooner or later, everybody has to sit down to a banquet of consequences. And I think the human race is just about to find that out.
I think so too. Yeah, I agree. And it just seems like there's a bit of a domino effect energetically and with everything that we're seeing unfolding. I want to ask, obviously, we're here to talk about biodiversity as the main topic of today's conversation. But banking to biodiversity, show me the way that you stopped being solely interested in and focused on money and investments and treasury, and then, hold on, we're killing the planet. What was your personal journey there?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about that is clearly you've never worked in a dealing room, because I used to work with wild animals. And I tell you what, I've never been afraid of real wild animals as I was of the people I used to work with. So I have a great degree of familiarity with wildness. But leaving that to one side, it came about in a kind of curious way, because my partner was a very keen traveler and I was not a very keen traveler, which seems 30 years later to be a very odd statement. But we went on a holiday. We went to actually Spain and Morocco, and I was bored to tears. The Alhambra is magnificent, some of the monuments, but if I see another cathedral, God forbid me. God forbid, I'll burn it to the ground, I think. So what actually happened at that point was she said, we have to go on a holiday. And I dreaded this statement. And I thought, where can we go? And as it turned out, we went to Africa before it became fashionable in 1991. And in one of the strangest things that you do in life, most people work their way up a progression and get to see mountain gorillas. Guess what? The first thing we went to do was see mountain gorillas. And we spent 2 hours, 1 hour with one group and 1 hour with the other. And I think I can't even begin to describe what actually happened. And I'm not a very touchy-feely person, or I'm not a very sort of what I would call, the best way to put it, herby-gerby sort of person.
You're not moved easily to...
No, I'm not moved easily. And suddenly this thing hit me. And later on, I understood what that was. And later on, I read Aldo Leopold. Aldo Leopold's a very interesting figure. In 1909, Aldo Leopold was a very young biologist. He worked as a ranger for the US Wildlife Service. And he went to the southern part of the United States.
Mm.
and his job was to survey the land. And one day when they were walking around, they saw this female wolf and pups, and they got their rifles and shot it, because that was what you did, because they were regarded as pests and vermin, and you exterminated them. Anyway, to make sure they were dead, Elder Leopold and his colleagues walked up to them, and he said he will never forget that moment, because he saw a green, fierce fire dying in the eyes of this female wolf. And I think the best way to describe it is changed him.
Mm.
Now, I have never shot anything. In fact, I hate guns. But I can understand what he was talking about. And what he did afterwards, is a remarkable man, is basically the sort of thing that happened. And then, perverse things being perverse, we got a trip to the Antarctic because the travel agent couldn't sell the last 2 berths on a ship, and Jade knew the travel agent. And next thing I know is we went to the Antarctic. And in our first 2 trips, we'd done the trips which are the iconic, I suppose, trips that everybody does. And from that moment on, I think the best way to describe it is, you correctly pointed out that I worked in finance. The best way to describe it is I sort of flirted with finance to make enough money to do the other thing. So this has been going on for 30 years. It's not new.
Okay. And would you classify those first 2 trips as ecotourism?
That term has been around for a long time, but in those days, I suppose it was not ecotourism in the sense we now understand it now. It was what people did, and that was available. And there was some element of conservation, some element of this, but there was a heck of a lot of novelty at that stage. Today, it's almost like a rigorous machine, ecotourism. It wasn't that in those days.
And would you say then what it has become has an unintended consequence sometimes?
Look, if you actually look at ecotourism, its objectives are tremendously laudable, because
Of
the whole
course.
idea is, if you preserve habitat, you preserve wilderness, and you preserve wild animal, you preserve biodiversity, all of that we can understand. And there are attendant benefits for human beings as well, because the communities, in theory, whose land it is, who live around there, get a benefit from that, either by working there or by being paid by people for them to preserve that land. Now, that's the ideal. What I've learned over 30 years, with increasingly growing alarm, is that the reality falls somewhat short of those very, very praiseworthy objectives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. My mother's from Mauritius, and something that I remember as a kid, and them even more so in their generation, is just expansive beaches, and you could dunk your pineapple in the sea, and just things that you could the little kids could go play with the turtles, and now it just feels like it's built up cement hotel resorts one after the other for the scuba diving trips and the things that are almost sort of activity oriented versus appreciating an environment.
Yeah, I always call it like, it's like a restaurant menu. I go
Yeah.
to places and you sort of tick off things on the restaurant menu, like, have I had that? Have I had that? Have I had that? Which wasn't really what it was when I originally started doing. There was a tremendous element of surprise and novelty. And I can still, even today, and it's like 30 something years, I can feel the awe I felt
Mm.
at some of the things. And it's very hard to recapture that now.
Yeah, I would say 30 years ago, we were probably, if you lived in a city, certainly, we were probably more disconnected from nature than we are now. We didn't even have the David Attenborough documentary series
Sure.
to connect us visually, or yeah, I feel like we at least know and appreciate more if one is interested. And so when you talk about wild quests, because this is where it gets interesting, what you're exploring and proposing a way forward when it comes to interaction and protection of biodiversity becoming the central theme to interaction with the natural world.
Yes, because I think there's a lot of stuff around biodiversity, because I think if you ask 5 people, you get about 6 opinions as to what
Mm-hmm.
biodiversity should be. But I think there's a fundamental issue which underlies that. Human beings have this rather strange perspective of themselves. They talk about nature, they talk about environment, they talk about biodiversity as if it's something that is external to them.
Mm.
My starting point is, hang on, we're part of this. And without it, we do not live. We live in this environment. And without the environment, we will not survive as a species.
Mm.
And that's the fundamental thing. I'll give you a couple of small examples, which are very interesting. The first is we're now having this huge problem with bees because suddenly people have said, oh my God, we need bees for pollination. And I'm sort of going, I'm being Homer Simpson and going, duh. It's
Mm.
not something new. It's been there all along. So what did you think destroying habitat would do to the bees? And now we have this enormous expense of people having to transport bees. And bees also have another point, as we know in Australia with varroa mites and also with foreign bees, which destroy native bees. These are all introduced species. People introduced them without
Mm.
any thought as to what happened. And that's obviously going to affect the habitat, the biodiversity, the environment. The other one is actually COVID-19.
Mm.
Everybody looks at COVID-19 and goes, oh, it's terrible. You know, we were locked up for a while. Uh, if you actually look at what COVID-19 represents, it represents a couple of things. The first thing, which I think is really important, is the process of zoonosis. And this
Mm.
is where diseases cross over from one species to the other. And why does that come about? It comes about very simply because what happens is we go into wild areas. We bring ourselves into contact with other creatures. And when we create human habitation, there's a couple of things that happen. There are a couple of species which actually multiply. One is bats, and the other is rats.
Mm.
One, bats because they eat a lot of insects and so forth, and human beings with waste and everything else create. The best way to describe it, human beings are a bat's idea for smorgasbord. And basically, rats are the same.
Mm.
And the problem is, both of these animals have quite robust immune systems. So they carry lots of things. It doesn't affect them. But all it needs is for that to cross over through the process of zoonosis. And COVID-19, though, as we know, there are more conspiracy theories about how COVID-19 started than there is, Sundays in a month. But basically, there is a strong element of zoonosis. And we're going to see this with bird flu. And I'm very sorry to say this, but COVID-19 is not the start or the end of this process.
Mm.
But so that affects human habitation, it affects human life, all of those things. The last other thing which is sort of related to that is, why is bird flu a problem? It's a mixing of wild birds and domestic birds. And the problem with that is we keep our domestic animals in particular conditions. I think if I'm actually a vegetarian, but I watch people eat meat and I always say to them, fine, you eat meat, that's your decision, it's got nothing to do with me. But the one thing that I would say is go and see the conditions under which animals are kept, go and see how they're killed, how the whole process goes on. And then if you can continue to eat meat, that's absolutely fine.
Mm.
But don't please sit there saying it comes in a nicely packaged plastic container in a supermarket and it's all benign, because it's not.
Mm.
And the problem is the mixing of wild birds and domestic animals. And what will happen, and everybody looks at South China, where a lot of this zoonosis takes place. And the reason is very simple. It's got a very high water table. It's got a lot of poultry, and it's also actually a stopping over point, on a flyway for lots of wild birds. That's where the crossover takes place. And when the crossover takes place through fecal matter, it gets into the water stream and the water table, and that's how it transfers. And
Mm.
that sort of stuff is things which are absolutely fundamental. But human beings sort of said that's a problem to be solved, and it is. But it also needs a deeper look at how we got to that problem. And we refuse
Mm-hmm.
to do that. We refuse to do that.
Right. And so is what you're saying there, the the way we have separated and compartmentalized is actually at the crux of why, when we then accidentally reintegrate, bad things happen.
I think that's very, very true. I'll give you another example of that. One of the things which is very big is everybody's into rewilding.
Mm.
So, and that's, to me, it's a complete joke. And the
Okay.
reason it's a complete joke is that what you take is land that you can't use for any other purposes.
Mm.
And then you say, what am I going to do with it? Well, I will rewild it and make it into a nature reserve. Okay, good idea. There's a fundamental problem with that. One is you can't have habitat, you can't regrow habitat. In a patch of rainforest, which is probably a kilometer square, there's probably 10,000 species of plants and animals.
Mm.
How are you going to recreate that? It's not possible for you to start from scratch and recreate. The thing that I always say is that nature doesn't need improvement. It's done fine for 4
Mm.
billion years without us.
Yeah.
So how do we suddenly presume that we're going to do this? But then it creates problems. Rewilding's being done in a lot of places in Europe and in a lot of places in England. But there's a paradox in that as well. We were rewilding until the Ukraine war happened, and then we all went, holy hell, we need to grow more food now, don't we? So
Mm.
rewilding off the table, we're now going to use it again for agriculture. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that land was being rewilded because of the subsidies in the European Union was going to be cut back. And therefore, it wasn't worth farming, but now it was. But
Mm-hmm.
then you rewild and you introduce species. Okay. And in Europe, there's this massive debate going on over the reintroduction of wolves. Wolves are an essential part of natural environments. They kill weak animals, they move ungulates around so they don't overgraze particular parts of the habitat. They're vital, okay? But
Mm.
you can't have tiny areas into which you introduce a wolf pack. They multiply, then they
Yeah.
spill over. And then there is now in Europe, they're going to, in my view, probably remove the protection of wolves. So having exterminated them, having now reintroduced them, we are now going to have to control them again. And underlying this is to show you how fickle and idiotic human beings are. Behind this is the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And she was a great ardent believer in rewilding and reintroduction of wolves. Now she's changed her mind. The fact that her precious 30-year-old pony, Dolly, was supposedly killed by wolves has absolutely nothing to do with it, of course. Absolutely nothing. Nothing to see here. Let's move on.
Wow. And so this is something a lot of people have an issue with, Daz, is this: we see leaders around the world do stupid stuff and act in knee-jerk fashions, act because they're getting paid a truck ton of cash by some lobby group. I mean, you're a big picture thinker. So how do we change that system? I know this is absolutely not what we're talking about on script today, but it's not often you get to talk to someone who's at the coalface of multiple issues and writing about and researching them all. And it is, I mean, you just mentioned one example where you'd see something like that and you just go, oh, God, it depends on who's in power at the time. It's so thin, the stability of things. I mean, someone could literally be having a bad day. Hitler got rejected by art school enough times that he went bonkers and started the Nazi party. I mean, like in history, you see it everywhere if you've studied history, and we see it today. Almost, it seems like more and more, where now we've got two very old grandpas fighting each other for the US
Well, the
election.
US election is, I think, what you're
I mean,
referring to.
well,
The
as
best
an
way to
example,
describe,
though, but
yeah,
it's
it
sort
is.
of, you wonder why people start theorizing and conspiring, and because so many people are just fed up and they all start their own little groups where things feel a bit more energized and normal and debatable, because we're not allowed to even debate anymore, you
I
know?
think the problem that you're pointing to has got to do with fundamentally the political system.
Mm.
Democracy is a great theory. Winston Churchill once explained democracy in terms of the fact that it was the worst of all possible systems, except the others. And that's the basic way to
Yeah.
describe it.
Yeah.
And the problem in a democracy is that fundamentally it's amateur hour. The entire democratic process is amateur hour. The reason is you and I are amateurs because we have to vote, and the only time we actually see our candidates is around an election, and
Mm.
they have half-baked policies which we can barely understand because they can barely understand them themselves.
Mm.
And then we have to vote, and it's the choice between, as you were talking about in the US. I mean, the US election is going to be vote for me because the other guy's worse. That's basically the only slogan
Well,
that you could
and it's been
possibly.
that way for nearly 20 years, I
Absolutely.
would argue. Yeah.
Absolutely. And somebody once said to me that you really are the most authoritarian, autocratic person that I've ever met. You want an autocratic ruler. I'm saying I'm not, I like my personal freedoms. But the point is that if you want to make real, meaningful change, and sometimes the change, as you correctly point out, is not a good change,
Mm.
but is where you have a leader who is not subject to the whims of people voting in them in and out. Because effectively, in all Western democracies, the policy framework is what I call NIMTO, not in my
Mm.
term of office. So
Hmm.
it doesn't matter. As long as it's not in my term of
Kick
office,
it
we can
down
get
the
a.
road long enough and then,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And you can't do that. And that's a fundamental problem that you have. People are highly critical of China, and there is a lot of things you can be critical about. But if they wanted to stop, emissions, they can do it tomorrow.
Mm.
Why? Because one person or one group of people decides that and said, this is how it's going to work.
Mm.
And you have no choice in the matter. Whereas we are now ossified in this wonderful debate, which, as I said, we will be debating it until the last person on earth chokes to death
Mm.
from something, because essentially we will never be able to resolve it. And essentially, the other part is there's a very good economist called Manker Olson who wrote The Logic of Collective Actions. And he pointed out the blindingly obvious in many ways, which is that in liberal democracies and in market systems, what actually happens is people organize. And
Mm.
eventually you get different groups organizing to the point where they offset each other. So basically nothing actually happens. We get complete total stalemate. And if you want to see an example of that, just look around the world, because that's
Mm.
what it is. And also, there is a fundamental problem here among individuals as well. For instance, we all love trees, but if it's blocking our view, we want to cut it down.
I literally just walked past a tree yesterday that had been poisoned.
Yes.
And, the council was saying, anyone who saw anything, let us know. And it happens to be in front of this beautiful apartment block that would have incredible views.
I don't think the
Uh,
police will have much difficulty in working out who that is. I think that shouldn't be too difficult to work
that
out
should be
who's
an
behind
easy
that.
one.
That should be easy.
Yes.
Proving it might be more tricky, but I think they would.
Well, yeah. And then you end up with people mysteriously donating a library wing to the new council library, and then they get off scot-free. And we now know about these systems and arrangements, and everyone's a bit jaded, I think.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing about that is the conservation movement, because in Wild Quest, I talk a lot about the conservation movements and
Mm.
NGOs. And one of the fundamental things about the conservation movement is every rich person in the world seems to have a plan for saving the planet,
Yeah.
except it doesn't affect them personally, it affects everybody else. And it's
Mm.
just quite a weird sort of world. And these contradictions are inbuilt into our democratic system, and they prevent us from dealing with problems. So you may not like autocracies, but under certain circumstances, perhaps that's the only way you can actually bring about major change.
It's such an interesting thing to think about. It is genuinely, because we're so frustrated with so many things that don't seem to change. And I remember when I was writing my second book about food, I don't, like you, I don't care what people eat, what your food mix is based on religion, preference, how your body feels eating certain foods. It's so different. It's a ridiculous thing to fight. But how are we farming? What kind of chemicals?
Sure.
You mentioned eat the meat, but look at all of the ways that that is coming to be on a plate. I agree. And I would also suggest people do that with their grains and vegetables.
Absolutely.
Go spend a day with your farmer who's unscrewing the glyphosate sometimes and then irrigating it across the fields and poisoning everything under the sun, in the name of crop yield while forsaking biodiversity. every food group has its evil side. And so I
Absolutely.
think for me, it's like we really need to find where we meet in the middle on things, where the overlaps are, if we're going to move forward in any meaningful or productive way.
Absolutely. But the problem in all of that is what we consider, what you might consider an equitable solution. Somebody else like
Mm.
me will say, no, no, that's not where the line should be drawn. And
Yeah.
we can't really ever get there. And this is a fundamental problem. And I think I've thought about this quite for a long time. And I said, why has this changed? I think we now live, particularly in Western societies, in this idea of individuality, because
Mm.
everything is around we have not got an idea of community. It's me. It's
Mm.
not we anymore. It's me. And unless we understand that there's a greater interest and accept that, and this is actually going to be played out, I suspect, in the election, which is what's known as losers' consent.
Mm.
If somebody votes you down, the entire system fails unless the loser accepts that they are not in the majority and accept the decision. Except in our world, losers don't accept the decision.
Nope. Yeah. And, I mean, look at people sinking the global financial crisis, or, all the golden parachutes that we see in corporate organizations where people have obviously done something awful and unjust and dishonorable. And it's cost either a company or the workers or the customers. And they get their little $40 million payout and get to go enjoy their lives.
I've always said this very easy way to sort out white collar crime
Mm.
is you take randomly one white collar criminal, hang him in Martin Place to an audience of business people. You do one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, one in Brisbane, one in Adelaide. You will have no more white collar crime
Mm.
after that one.
Mm.
And my view is it should be random. Like you say, I don't really care who it is or what it is. I'm just going to do this randomly to make my point that if you play this game, well, you never know. You might be hanging without a chair.
So controversial, Daz. I think you'll get a few people a bit hot under the collar on that statement. But I completely get your point. It is this lack of culpability and accountability and appropriate justice for actions taken. People are sick of it. And I genuinely believe it's one of the biggest things playing into the polarization we're seeing around the world
Oh,
now.
I think you're absolutely right. I have no
Mm,
doubt you're right.
wow. Let's talk about nature again. That's far more. I need a break. Wild quests. I guess I want to ask you what you hope to achieve with this book, because we always, as an author, you write and you just hope when someone takes that, something lands deeper for them than it did before they had that in their hands.
Sure.
What is that for you?
This isn't an easy book to write, and it
No.
wasn't an easy book to write. And it was actually a harder book to get published, actually, than to write even. And I'll tell you about a couple of publishers who I won't name because it would be embarrassing. One said, "This is just so confronting." And I said, "Well, it's actually the truth." And they said, "No, no, no, you can't. The reader won't read this." And I said, "Well, I don't know what the reader wants. How do you know what the reader wants?" And they said, "Oh, you've got to give them an off-ramp, an easy way to do that." I said, "Well, I'm going to give them a little button, say, click here to save the world or something like that."
Donate
And
$1 today.
exactly, $1 a day and the world will be saved. And
Mm.
so it's a difficult book to write. And in a way, what I wanted to do was challenge orthodoxy, because the orthodoxy is the wild world is absolutely fine. We watch David Attenborough
Mm.
documentaries. Look at the pristine world out
I
there.
know. I think it's a false sense of security watching those docos, isn't it?
It is, it is.
Mm.
And let's come back to that. But anyway, so I wanted to force people to confront one of the prime sort of what I would call underpinnings that ecotourism is. Conservation is like a fig leaf on ecotourism. And it's an area I know very well because I've spent so much time going around the world and traveling. So it was a very obvious way to bring out. And the book really, if you actually read it carefully, is a celebration of animals, but also a criticism of what we've done to them. And
Mm.
it's the two levels. And what I wanted to do was draw attention to them. And there are deeper issues, like what is causing the problem and possibly looking at ways to do it. But what we were talking about Aldo Leopold a little earlier, and one of the things that I learned reading, and he's got a wonderful book called The Sand County Almanac, which is very, very short and now very, very famous. But in it, he wrote that if you want to experience nature, you have to go into a world of wounds. And he said there's two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it is you just assume that everything that's wrong is not your problem.
Mm.
And I could have done that. I could have basically gone and essentially seen what I wanted to see and basically turned away from all of the other things, but I
Mm.
couldn't. And that's the second choice that Aldo Leopold gives you. He said, then you become a witness, that you have to harden yourself and say, what am I going to do? And one of the things you can do is be a witness. Now, I don't know if people will read this book. I don't know even if people will like it. But what I want to do with the book is to be a witness to what we've done. And that to me is very important.
Yeah.
And the book ends with an interesting phrase. There's a wonderful, he's now dead, called Barry Lopez. He was a Canadian. And I think he had, I'm not 100% sure, but I think he had Inuit blood. And he wrote a wonderful book called Arctic Dreams, which is really a ramble of his time in the Arctic. And there's a little bit in it which was kind of interesting. And a horned lark is a very common bird. I mean, if you go to that part of the world and you don't see a horned lark, there's something wrong. And when he saw a horned lark on the tundra once, he sort of looked at it and he almost unconsciously bowed to it. And it became his habit. So whenever he saw wild things, he bowed to it. It was a mark of respect.
Mm.
And to me, in many ways, Wild Quest is attempting to respect what we don't respect,
Mm.
which is the other denizens of the planet, who are, in every sense of the world, equal possessors of the earth.
I think it's excellent that you're brave enough to write a book like this.
Or stupid enough.
Fellow author here, so I get it. It's always, especially when you're trying to do things that either, save the health system or fix the planet with agricultural change or whatever it might be. But with you, what you've done it's almost, I feel like you're inviting us to also remember what it is we might be fighting for if we did decide to take up the mantle of witness.
Very much so, because it's kind of difficult for people who don't experience it. But even the people who are not, I suppose, very deeply attracted to it, to see certain birds and so forth in the wild. I mean, anybody who has seen some of the birds of paradise in Papua New Guinea, they are just outrageous.
Mm.
There's a thing called the kingbird of paradise, which is tiny. It's about this big. Because the first time I saw one, I found myself on the ground. He was about 40 meters above us. And I was looking at it through binoculars, and I turned to the guide and said, it's small, isn't it? And he goes,
Mm.
it's about this big. And it's outrageous. It's red. Its head is this bizarre shape. It's got tails with these saucers at the end of it, which it waves around during mating things. And I would defy anybody to see this and not stand there in awe. And I mean, one of the great, great naturalists and also collectors of specimens, which means killing them, was A.E. Russell, the famous uh, uh, naturalist who wrote the Malay Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And the first time he saw a kingbird of paradise in the wild, because he'd only seen skins or people's paintings of it, he was without words. He said he couldn't find words to describe the beauty. And this is somebody who knew what he was looking at.
Mm.
So it's quite astonishing. We've spent 8 weeks in Mexico, and very recently, and for a whole bunch of reasons, we had some problems, and we ended up having to change our trips. And in the end, we went down the Pacific coast of Mexico, to very close to the border with Guatemala. And there's a place there. It's a small place. It's a community-run project, and the man's called Pablo. And so we had to go and find Pablo, which was kind of difficult because there's no mobile reception. So our guide kept ringing Pablo and saying, "Are you there? And can we come?" And all this sort of stuff. Anyway, and we stayed at this very small facility they have, which I can tell you ain't 5-star luxury.
Mm.
That's the first thing I would say. If you like cold showers, it's fine. If you don't like cold showers, don't bother. And the food is, I love the food because I'm a vegetarian, I said this, and the woman, who's a lovely woman, kept repeating the same thing. And I said to our guide, David McKay, I said, "Does she get what I'm saying?" And David looked at me and smiled and said, "I think she's telling you that's the only thing on the menu. And that's what you're going to eat if you want to eat. You're not going to get anything else. So don't
Uh-huh.
assume anything." Anyway, we went with Pablo into the mangroves.
Mm.
And very few people go here because it's kind of out of the way of the normal tourist trail in Mexico, even for wildlife enthusiasts. And you go along a main river in a motorboat, and then he turns off the motor. And it's a small boat, it's a skiff with enough for 4 people. And then he paddles into these mangroves. And we spent 3 hours in the mangroves. And the mangroves are so close that they touch you.
Mm.
And the wildlife is completely, totally unaccustomed to humans, so they don't fear us. It's exactly the opposite of if they're accustomed to you. If they're accustomed to you, they're going the other way at a rate of knots because they know who's coming.
Yeah, yeah.
They basically were completely curious as to who's coming in. And they see Pablo quite often, so they're probably comfortable around the boat. But there's a bird called the agami heron. Now, we've seen an agami heron, a juvenile, once in Venezuela 20 years ago, and I've always wanted to see a full adult. And one of the attractions of going here was they said, you might be able to see agami herons. Boy, oh boy, did we see agami herons. There was like about 8 or 9 of them. And to give you an idea of this bird, it's a sign of an ibis, the big
Mm-hmm.
chickens
Yeah,
we've
yeah,
grown
yeah.
up with.
Yeah.
They've got short legs. It's got chestnut on its breast. It's blue on top, but on its breast, it has these filamentous figures of feathers, basically, which are silvery. And you can take photos of them till the cows come home, and we don't take photos. But the thing is, you can never capture the refraction of light on those.
Mm.
And you're seeing this like 3 feet away. And David Mackay, who our guide was, said, "I'm never going to get a better chance to take a photo of one." So "Excuse me, I'm going to take it." I said, "Fine, David." And then he says, "It's too close. I can't focus." I said, "What do you want us to do? You can get out and climb on the mangroves if you want to. I'm not getting out of the boat for you. So it's too bad, you know." But the beauty of that will stay with me forever.
Mm.
And, in my quiet moments when I think of that, to have seen that, it's just quite extraordinary. So the experience that people are, and the thing that really grieves me is we're destroying this.
Yeah.
And for what?
Mm.
For what?
And it's so interesting to me because we distance ourselves, we cut ourselves off. If you're interested in nature, if you opt in as a separate person from nature, you can then go and be in nature. But then humans recreate it in different ways. Look at the Met Gala or haute couture. We want that fancy, that beauty, that I can't believe someone has created this for me to look at. We need that wonder in form and color and display, and yet it exists already, and we've cut
Absolutely.
ourselves off from it.
Absolutely. And it's quite bizarre. I can't remember who it was. One of the haute couture fashion designers once made the comment that he got a lot of his ideas from looking at birds
Yeah,
and
that's why I
animals.
mentioned it,
Yeah,
because
and he said looking at the
so
colors and so
obvious.
forth. It's just such an obvious. And you get contrasts like colors you would never ever mix.
Hmm.
And you sort of think, how the hell does
Where the
nature do
sales
that?
assistant says, "Why don't you do this?" And you're like,
Yeah,
"What?"
yeah,
And you
you've
put
got to
it
be
on, you're like,
kidding.
"Well, that actually works."
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's just extraordinary. And my fear is that in 10, 20 years' time, this will all be gone.
Mm.
And then, you know, what are we leaving for future generations? What are we
Yeah.
leaving? And they will see things. I'm not saying nature will be destroyed, but what they're seeing is like animals in a cage. I mean, you can go to Africa and you can go to certain places, but to me, they don't feel wild anymore. They're
Mm. Well,
like
we take
basically
away
outdoors.
we've taken away the rainbow and we've replaced it with beige.
Exactly. And
Mm.
the other interesting issue about that is people also have this innate desire to be guaranteed to see something. And in
So
Mexico,
true. It's
in
like I paid for this, damn
that's
it.
right.
Where's my gorilla?
That's right.
Yeah.
And in Mexico, there's a bird
Mm.
called the Navis wren, which used to be part of the Summicrest wren complex. It was a subspecies, but it was separated out. It's a most unimpressive bird, I have to tell you. It's what
Mm.
bird is often referred to as LBJs, little brown jobs.
No.
So it's about this big. It's a wren,
Yeah.
but big for a wren, got a curved beak. But it's very interesting in terms of wrens, which tend to sort of sulk in
Mm.
bushes, but these live in limestone karst forests, and they're quite unique. And what I wanted to see was, we saw one Simicrest wren, and I wanted to see the Navis wren to see how different it was and why they were different and why they were separated. Anyway, we went to Tuxtepec
Mm.
and spent 36 hours traipsing up and down and up and down and up and down, looking for the Navis wren. And the weather was against us, the winds were against us, the birding gods were against us, everything was against us, and we didn't see it. But
Mm.
I don't actually mind. I really don't mind. And I was a bit grumpy at the end of that experience. I'd be dishonest if I said I was smiling. I was sort of gritting
Yeah.
my teeth, going, "Oh my God, I've put in this much effort. Surely somebody should
Something.
reward me."
Mm.
But don't, and a lot of the things we've seen in the wild are accidental.
Mm.
And the funniest thing was, we went to Brazil last year with a friend of ours, Frederico. Frederico has guided us before, and he and us, we get on very well. And he took us, and we were driving up this place on the coast near Sao Paulo. There's a park called Itatiaia. It's the oldest national park in Brazil. Anyway, we're driving up this road and we're just chatting, actually, because we wanted to get to the top of the hill and then we're going to walk down. Anyway, suddenly we see this small cat-like thing walking us the road. And I said, "Fred, what's that?" And he looks at it and says, "It's an onchilla." And an onchilla is a small cat. And they're about the size of a house cat. They're not much bigger than that. And there's
Mm.
three groups. There's the ocelot group, there's the margay group, and the onchilla group. And we saw it literally for 20 seconds because it stopped, because otherwise we wouldn't have seen it. It stopped on the edge of the road to look back at us. And that's when we saw it. And anyway, we were sort of all completely blown away by this. And then I said to Fred, "I assume you've seen one before." And he looked at me and said, "Are you kidding? I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never seen one before."
Mm.
And he said to me, "The most ironic thing in life is, here you are, you've spent probably a sum total of 3 months in Brazil and you've actually seen one. It's really irritating." So you have to take the good and the bad, but it's
Mm.
about the fact that these creatures exist, that they actually exist, this wilderness exists. And that's what I fear doesn't
And
have a long time to go.
And obviously, we have a lot of NGOs working around the world trying to do their bit and put together conservation campaigns. And, I think I've done everything from sponsor a koala to, I've done it all. I've got to say, because you think, well, it's with my son and I want him to grow up conscious. So this would be
Sure.
a lovely thing to just plant the seed that we need to care about more than what's happening in your little daily life. Um, but there are issues with the effectiveness of that work. It
Sure.
seems like we're not really moving forward and getting in front of the problems that we face with species extinction. So,
If you look at NGOs, they're fascinating. And I had a very, very long look at people like the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, and traced their history through. And the problem is that essentially they're fundraising organizations.
mm,
In the end, the basic thing that they're into is fundraising, and they spend a lot of the money in fundraising and in admin. The money that flows through into the actual work is quite limited.
I
It's
was going
actually
to
a fraction.
say, because it also costs a lot of money to employ the people to do the
Correct.
campaigns. So,
It's
and this is by, if anyone's listening who works for any of these organizations, I have many friends who do. It's not a criticism of you as a
no,
person. It's just trying to understand a system and
correct.
solutions that might actually get in front of the problems we're all chasing.
Absolutely. Look, the people who are all doing this are good people.
Mm,
They have all their emotions and their feelings and their moralities in the right places.
mm,
But the system itself is deeply flawed.
mhm.
And so, firstly, the amount of money that goes there doesn't really mean that all the money goes there. The second thing is they spend all their time fundraising. So basically, in the old days, the money used to come from individuals like you and me and from government, but governments have scaled that back. So what they're now after is rich donors,
Yeah.
and which I call the eco barons.
Hmm.
And the best way to describe, I've spent a lot of time around rich people because if you work in banking, there's no point in, as I once explained to people, there's no point in going to poor people. They don't have any money. So they're not going to invest. So you have to go after rich people. He was a bit shocked at my lack of social morality. I said, I'm just stating a fact. I mean, it's just a fact.
Mm,
And these people are whimsical. They flirt from one thing to the other. And they've got no idea 9 times out of 10 of what they're looking at. And I call it the last person syndrome, which is the last person to have talked to them before they're signing a check is the person who's going to get the money.
mm,
And they have really strange ideas of what they're doing. For instance, Henry Paulson, who is once the US Treasury Secretary and basically was the chief of Goldman Sachs for a number of years, has a foundation. And I know where the money goes because I know some of the recipients. And basically, some of the money does good, some of them it doesn't do good. But he's bought up an entire area of the Pantanal for himself
mm,
because he wants to leave it pristine, but he also wants to go there alone. He doesn't want to have to go there with other people. So
mm,
there's a lot of conflicts involved in that, but there's a fundamental conflict underlying this. And that conflict has to do with the raison d'etre of an NGO. Let's say you have a problem, which is to fix biodiversity. Once you fix the problem, you've done yourself out of a job. So
mm.
bad news for the environment is actually good news for these people because it attracts donors, it attracts interest, it attracts volunteers, all of those types of things.
It's like cockroach killer or mold sprays.
Absolutely. You create the mold and
Yeah,
then you do that.
yeah.
But I have to tell you a lovely story is if you want to see a good example of that, I saw that in Africa 30 years ago. There was this group of kids because we were waiting for somebody on the side of the road. They dug a big hole in the road and they would stand around with shovels. And then if a car came, because the car couldn't navigate the road, they go up to there and say, well, if you give us some money, then we'll
Mm.
fill the road in. Then they'd fill it in. And after they got the money, then the car would go. Then they would quickly make the hole again.
Wow.
And to me, that's just about sums up NGOs in a
Mm,
perverse sort of way. But also, NGOs will not tackle the real issue. We can talk about the real causes of loss of biodiversity. And if you actually think about the problems of NGOs and conservation, you can start by saying, well, what are the problems? The problems are very easy to diagnose. You don't have to have a PhD to do them. One is habitat destruction. We're destroying habitat in which wild animals live. The second, of course, is overharvesting. We kill them, we overfish. We were talking about birds of paradise. Birds of paradise were
mm,
nearly wiped out because people kept collecting their feathers to adorn rich people's hats of all things. So
mm,
basically, that's the second problem. The third problem is what I call islandization, which is basically you have these islands that we've now created because once there were human populations surrounded by wilderness. Now there is human populations surrounding wilderness. It's completely different. And you isolate them, you denude their genetic diversity, you don't allow transference of populations from one area to the other. The fourth is obviously things like introduced species. I mean, in Australia, introduction of cane toads has been a complete, total, utter disaster
Yeah.
together with the rabbits. And the last one is obviously climate change. And to some extent, ecotourism also creates damage. So these are 6 things. We can actually address all of those things. Okay. The problem is underlying that is bigger things, which no NGO wants to talk about. First and foremost is population. There's 8 billion people on the planet. And at the moment, what they consume in terms of resources requires 1.7 Earths.
Yeah.
And that's with probably 7 billion of them living at standards of living, which are well below that of what you and I enjoy. And if they come to our level of standards, we're going to need about 3 to 4 Earths.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is we only have one of them. So that's one of the major problems that we have to deal with. But you can't actually ever talk about that. The moment you mention this, people say, well, you want to have involuntary euthanasia. You know, you're actually a eugenist. And if you talk to scientists, scientists will write their papers, never ever confront this issue head on. Why? Because they're terrified. The very funny story around that, Sir Peter Scott, who was one of the founders of World Wildlife Fund, was interviewed, I think, about 20 or 30 years ago, and about his work. And he said, you know, I feel like a complete failure because what I wanted to do was to save wild animals from extinction. And I failed miserably. What I really should have done with all the money is basically bought condoms and given it to people, because that actually would have had some concrete effect. So one of the problems of NGOs have, and it's not a criticism of NGOs, is if they want to raise money, if they want to be social actors, if they want to participate in the process, then they can't raise the real issues. I mean, I don't care. I'm 66 years old and I don't have much left to go. I don't care. And I don't care whether anybody really thinks well of me or badly of me and thinks whether, you know, I'm a eugenist or not. I don't care. But people who care, who are in their career, and remember, NGOs are now a career path. This is not people who would just have a passion. There is a career path. Actually, I went to an NGO presentation and I said to the guy, I said, this reminds me so much of McKinsey's. He said, oh, I used to work there.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
And
Yeah.
I looked at him and I thought, that explains all the beautiful PowerPoint slides and the mission statements and the visions and the
But do you
outcomes.
think part of that is to then appeal to the people who see that as a quality organization worth giving to, who are from those investment bank, high net worth philanthropy?
It might be because they do demand certain
Yeah,
standards.
of
Certainly, they
course.
want better chocolate
So,
biscuits and
yeah, so
coffee.
it's almost like, because we've ended up with the private philanthropy model of
Correct.
Save the World, we've then had to
Absolutely.
corporatize NGOs.
I think that's an important point. I think you're absolutely right. That is actually quite important in the way that we've done it. And the problem with that is half of them think this is a business problem to be solved. I think this is an existential problem.
Agreed.
And you
We
know,
got to dig deep on this.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you can't sort of treat this as a sort of business problem. As I say, this is not sort of, let's not do a SWOT analysis here of strengths, weakness, opportunities, threat here, because all I see is the last T. That's what I see. I
Yeah.
don't see much of the SWO in here at the moment. So that's and people often forget that what we're talking about here is vital to our survival. Because as we started this discussion, we're part of nature. And one of the major problems that I constantly grapple with is trying to explain to people that if we lose biodiversity, if we lose wilderness, there's nothing to actually say that we are going to survive as a species. And the fundamental thing is there's basically, I look at nature in a very simplistic way. There are 3 rules. One, there is an ecosystem with certain resources. and there's a balance of species within it. Once
Mm.
that balance gets disturbed, what happens is the dominant species either destroys the habitat by over-consuming
Mm.
resources or over-consuming all the other denizens of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And eventually the way that ends is pretty straightforward,
Mm-hmm.
which is the offending species is dies off.
Yeah.
And we have this picture that somehow, and we have this godlike belief in technology that somehow we can control all of this. I mean, people fail to grasp that a force 5 hurricane has more power than the entire nuclear arsenal of
Mm.
all the superpowers in the world. So the best way to describe it, we are children playing with little toys
Yeah.
compared to the forces that are there. And essentially, we're nothing more than apes. I mean, apes with smartphones, albeit, but basically but I often think that the phones are actually smarter than we are. And we don't really understand that this is an existential problem. And we
Mm.
don't want to understand this because the answer I get to that, oh, you're a Luddite. You know, technology will solve all these problems. And my answer to that always is, right, okay, how did we get into this problem in the first place? Like, do you think Diesel and Daimler sat around saying, if I build an internal combustion engine and use fuel to do that, where does the exhaust go? And what
Mm.
happens when that, do you think they actually thought through the problem? We
Mm.
didn't. And so we're now putting, and this is one of the really tragic things that we're doing, is we're putting our faith in lots of technology, which may or may not work. But the problem is whether it works or doesn't work, it'll damage the environment in a different way. For instance, we're not going to burn fossil fuels, but we're going to mine lots of copper.
Yeah.
How does that actually solve anything? So
Mm-hmm.
my concern is that we have considerable intellectual achievements as a species, but basically my concern is that if we don't address this, then those same intellectual achievements that we have will lead to our extermination. And by the way, that's how nature works. It
Yeah.
gets rid of useless adaptations. And I
Mm.
have a dreadful feeling that we're like a end chain. I always joke that we like the giant panda. And somebody said, what do you mean that we like the giant panda? There's no resemblance. And I said, well, the giant panda, when you sit down and actually analyze them, is a species which was always doomed to going extinct. It's actually kind of useless. And it's very specialized. It only eats a certain type of food, lives in a certain type of habitat, is terrible at mating and reproducing. And I can't see exactly how this species is going to survive. With all
Mm.
the help in the world, it's not going to survive. So, we have to admit that. And I said, that's why I think we're like that, because we're quite useless as well.
Yeah.
And people don't want to hear that, obviously.
No, I mean, you just have to look at how long it takes for a baby to be even half independent.
Well, some would argue that you and I aren't probably fully independent yet, so that's probably true.
I have one more question before I ask you for a bit of a call to action question. And the precursor question is, how do you reconcile on a personal level travel? Because I am Mauritian French on one side, British on the other. My family is very dear to me, and I prioritize seeing them
Sure,
with my spare cash. Um, and and I do often think about the ramifications of that. And then you could argue, well, travel isn't the big thing. If you're doing this, this, and this, then that matters more. And think of all the good work you're doing here, and we're all a soup. And as long as we're tending to mostly decent ingredients, we can have a couple of not so optimal options. But I mean, you've mentioned your travel passion several times
sure.
throughout our trip. So I'm just curious to see how you reckon. Is it something you think about? Is it?
Oh, it's something I think about almost
Mm,
constantly,
hmm.
and it troubles me deeply. I could give you a very glib answer, is to say that I don't have children, and having children is probably the most polluting thing that you can actually do.
Mm,
But that's a glib answer. That's not the real answer. The real
hmm.
answer is that we are now very parsimonious in our travel. We try and travel only where there is something we really want to see. And I almost have to go through a 10-point list saying, does it meet all of those? We select our destinations very carefully, and we try and do a couple of things. We don't go to places which are over trafficked. We tend to go to places which are less trafficked. The operators we use, we have certain filters that we use. The first filter we have is we use locals, which sometimes causes the most gigantic stuff ups that you've ever seen. Like, the guide who was a birding guide turns to be a climbing guide. And I said, I didn't come to climb mountains here, kiddo. I'm not into climbing. So let's find somebody who actually knows what I'm looking for. So we try and basically help the local economy. We will go to local community projects, we'll support them. We traveled 1,000 kilometers round trip in Brazil along not so nice roads and to not so nice accommodation, I have to say, to see one single bird. And it's a local community which supports this particular conservation project. So we try to keep our footprint as low as possible. But, our travel, people laugh at me because I'm constantly planning 3, 4, 5 years ahead. They, I don't think I've ever traveled. Jade laughs. She's my partner. She just laughs. She says that somebody said, if we go there, what can we see? So just hang on, I'll get Das, because he'll probably have about 30 files on this particular topic that you've just asked. And
After having spoken to you for an hour, I don't doubt that at all.
Absolutely. And so I research it and I make the choices. I'm not trying to justify what I do. I do understand the damage. And I hope that it helps people. I hope it basically preserves some of those things. I'm not sure it will, but I do try very hard. And it goes back to the point I made earlier, is I'm very careful at basically being a witness. I want to be, if nobody else wants to be a witness to this, at least I will be a witness to what we've done. And that's very important to me.
And is that for you a sense of accountability on behalf of the human race?
I'm not as presumptuous to say that I'm doing it on behalf of the human race, but it's something I'm doing for myself. And hopefully people who might be interested in that, I'm happy to do that. But I also know that some people will interpret that as just ex post justification. And I'm sure, and I acknowledge there is an element of that. But I honestly don't think, in the way the human race operates, you can't actually preserve these places without monetizing them in some way. I hate to use that word, but it is. But for instance, I've been talking to a friend of mine in Argentina, and we were talking about different models because he's actually runs a reserve. I said, look, you're going to have to get people in to get some cash flow and some revenue. So my suggestion is they've now bought another piece of land and it backs onto a major national park. I said, why don't you work with the park authorities and allow people into one part of it and leave the rest untouched? No roads, no nothing. And the only people who can go that are, researchers, but they have to sign a pact with you that they go in on foot. They have to use tents. And you might eventually allow some tourists to go in with the researchers under very strict conditions, but you're not going to allow wholesale damage to that. And he's thinking about that and thinking whether of that it is. But his problem is one of his funders is a big American corporation. And I said, how do you think they'll take to it? They said the problem with them is they'll want to come once a year to go and see everything and to see that whether we've done everything right. And what you're saying is we'll say to them, well, you can't go there, you can't go there, you can't go there. That's all off limits. So there are tensions in here. And I live with those contradictions every day of my life.
And do you think, coming back to something we were talking about very much at the start, which was this failed notion of idealist democracy and all of us trying to sort of justify our points and the individual, being able to have their opinion and therefore we don't move forward. Is acknowledging our contradictions actually part of the healing towards starting to move forward? I think it is.
I think it's a very important thing. One of the most annoying words in the modern vocabulary to me is conversations. As I keep saying to people, we are having
Start a
conversations.
conversation.
Yeah, we are all having conversations, but we are doing absolutely effing nothing.
All talk and no action.
That's right. So my view would be, okay, I may not agree 100% with what you're saying, but let's start. Let's start to do something. And this is where I have some sympathy for NGOs and some of the people, and particularly smaller ones, which I genuinely think have the right idea, is they're actually doing things. We met this wonderful guy who has this name. When I heard it, all I could do was not start to laugh. His first name is Elvis.
Oh,
He's
fabulous.
he's Brazilian, and a Brazilian named Elvis. I thought, this is really weird. What he's done is he used to work for the water company in this area, and he retired from the water company, and he's bought this plot of land and he's added on things. It's on the edge of a national park, and he's starting to restore some of it. And he's basically trying to preserve as much habitat as possible. And we were happy to stay. He's got 2 rooms. We stayed there with him. And those types of efforts are a beginning. You know, Lasse said that every, journey begins with a step. And I'm not saying any of these steps are perfect, but underlying this all is really what we need to think about is that Mahatma Gandhi once said, there is enough on the planet for man's needs, but not enough for man's greed. And
Accurate.
until we basically adjust our living standards, our populations, to what this planet can actually provide, it's very difficult to make progress.
And so the call to action, how can we create an on-ramp rather than the off-ramps that we're constantly craving because it's all too much?
Well, I think we were talking about Lao Tse, the Chinese philosopher. He had this wonderful statement, is the truth is rarely beautiful, but beautiful words are rarely true. So we have to get away from this business about we want pleasantness. We have to face the unpleasantness of what we've done. And it goes back to where you started. We have to understand the consequences of who we are, what we've done. And then we need to say, well, that's not actually what we want to be. And that's got to be the way forward. And I think eventually that will happen. To what degree, I don't know. I just hope it's not too late by then.
And I think it's almost up to all of us to reflect on how we can take that step forward, what that looks like for us wherever we are as well.
Yes, it's individual. I would be lying to you if I said I had every answer. I have some views and I'm willing to debate that view. But we have to accept that we can't go on the way we are going on. And that's got to be the first step.
Well, here's to that first step. And I so appreciate your time having a brave conversation around these topics because I use the word conversation, Daz. Oh, no. But it is important for us to actually talk about those frictions and acknowledge that they're unproductive. So thank you for the work you do. Thank you for Wild Quests. I really think it's a special work that people should confront themselves with because there's a lot of beauty in that as well that you explore to show us what we're fighting for. And here's to that next step for us all.
Here's to the next step.
I hope you loved today's show as much as I loved bringing it to you. I want to remind you that if you are someone who craves a low tox community that is judgment-free, full of empowerment, has health professionals and building health professionals that can support you, as well as me in there answering questions multiple times a week, I want to invite you to join the Low Tox Club. For the price of less than a cup of coffee, a month, you have an annual membership for $49 Australian, so it's about $30 US or euro, that allows you to have a member masterclass every single month with a health professional or global expert from the podcast, where we have them to ourselves for an hour to ask questions and deep dive further. You have the beautiful supportive chat group. You have Q&As with me answering questions. We read books and talk about them, and a whole bunch more. You can head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the explore tab, and join the club is the very first option on that list. Of course, we have over 10 evergreen courses that you can jump into anytime, whether it's navigating everyday low tox swaps with our Go Low Tox signature course, whether you have kids and you're wanting to know how to best support them with our Low Tox Kids course, whether you're planning a family and looking at a healthy low tox preconception journey, reducing inflammation, especially the chronic kind, with our Inflammation Ninja course, many other courses. You can again head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the courses tab, and you'll see all of the options, which includes a business course, my Low Tox Method program. A lot of people don't know, but I was doing a lot before starting Low Tox Life in 2009, and I was a business consultant across hospitality, health, retail, and cosmetics. I have been in business consulting for a very long time, so I absolutely adore helping people move into the low tox space or develop their low tox businesses. So that's a way I can support you. And then, of course, there's our wonderful social media communities at Low Tox Life on Instagram, and of course, the website with over 250 gluten-free recipes, blogs, downloadable PDFs to help you navigate wanting to get rid of synthetic fragrances in your school or office. I could go on. So head to lowtoxlife.com, see what takes your interest or fancy, and thank you so much for being a part of our podcast community. I love reading your reviews. I appreciate every follow and subscribe, and I want to just remind you to finish off that if there's anything you heard that you found interesting from a medical or scientific perspective, it is intended as education only. Please always chat to a health professional who knows you and your situation best. I'll see you next week. Bye.